Did some dinosaurs sleep in bird-like positions? That's the claim of a recent research article, and that's caught the attention of one Ken Ham, the leading young Earth creationist in the world. And he, once again, has his feathers ruffled about feathered dinosaurs and bird-like dinosaurs. Yeah, I've talked about it many times before, but Ken Ham keeps talking about it. This time, I think he's gone way overboard in his reaction. I'm Joel Duff, and in my world, curiosity is king, evidence is paramount, and the clash between biblically informed principles of science and creationism, or so-called creation science, is an opportunity for enlightenment. So here you are today. Join me for this episode of Ham Bytes, where we react and respond to the words of Ken Ham and learn something along the way. We've got all that coming up next. Yep, here we go. This is the headline. It was blaring on Answers in Genesis a few days ago. Newly discovered dinosaur behaved like a bird. Ken Ham has a lot to say about people calling dinosaurs birds or having bird-like features. Because in his mind, the two never should be ever connected together. After all, birds were created on the fifth day of creation, whereas dinosaurs, land-breathing, walking animals, were created on the sixth day. There can be no connection to them. There can be no historical connection to them, right? They don't share common ancestors. Now, of course, he would also agree that an ostrich and an eagle also don't share any common ancestry, have no history as well. And yet he believes that it's okay to call that category birds. Those aren't the same kind. They're different kinds, but they're in the same category. And so he wants to have this category of reptile, even though it's an artificial category, even biblically speaking. And he wants to have a category birds or flying things, except he, wouldn't necessarily put bats in that particular category. So biblical taxonomy is a very messy, complicated thing. But to hear Ken Ham talk, it's simple. Birds aren't dinosaurs. Dinosaurs aren't birds. And any suggestion that there's any combination of the two organisms is simply falling prey to evolutionary assumptions that birds are nothing but an evolved form of dinosaur. All right, this is well-worked ground. We've talked about this many times. What's new today? What do we got that's new? What has Ken Ham said that's new? Well, nothing new in particular, but he's, I'm just going to try to show the hypocrisy of some of his statements today. And it really comes out in this very short article. Now, when we see such headlines as dinosaurs from newfound species died in pose that sheds light on evolution of bird behavior, the first question we should ask, according to Ken Ham, is, did they find a bird or a dinosaur? Right? It's got to be one or the other. It can't be both. There's birds and there's dinosaurs. So what did they actually find? And this is the chore of any young Earth creationist in Ken Ham's mind. You must find the dividing line between bird and dinosaur. And once you've decided one is one and one is the other, never shall one suggest that it's an intermediate between the two. Did they find a bird or a dinosaur? And nearly every time the headline says the creature was bird-like or had bird-like behaviors, what you're reading about is a bird, not a dinosaur. Okay, now that's quite a statement by Ken Ham. Actually, it's probably not a statement by Ken Ham because, of course, he uses a writing team to write his blog post. So who actually wrote this, I don't know, but Ken Ham is taking responsibility. All right, it's under his name. These words are under his name and therefore represent his understanding of taxonomy. What you're reading about, if you see somebody say something is bird-like, then what you're actually reading about is a bird. That's apparently his new definition of how to determine what is a bird and what is a dinosaur. If a dinosaur has any supposed bird-like characteristic, then you simply toss it out of the dinosaur category and you throw it into the bird category. Now, is he aware of how many dinosaurs he's going to have to throw into the bird category if it has a bird-like behavior or bird-like feature? A whole lot of dinosaurs. A large percentage of the dinosaurs now have just become birds in Ken Ham's mind. since there are somebody somewhere who has referred to some characteristic of some of those dinosaurs as having bird-like features. Terrible characteristic to use for your taxonomic delineation of different forms of organisms. Because evolutionists are so convinced of their story that dinosaurs evolved from birds, they will often describe birds as dinosaurs. You see, they don't want to admit they're birds. They want to call them dinosaurs. They want to push birds into the dinosaur category so that they can create a story of dinosaurs becoming birds. Even living birds sometimes are referred to as dinosaurs. Well, if birds evolved from dinosaurs, then they are a type of dinosaur. It's often really difficult to distinguish between whether an article is describing a bird or a dinosaur. But as in the case of this new creature, it looks like a bird and it acted like a bird, as much as we can answer that from the fossil record, then it was likely a bird, right? Walks like a duck, talks like a duck, then it's a duck. In Kenny Ham's mind, taxonomy is simple, right? Look, it looks like it, it sounds like it, that's what it is. This is a good reminder to be discerning as we read the news. Headlines certainly don't tell you the whole story. I absolutely agree. I'm very frustrated by the headlines, especially of science news, misrepresenting the original articles. And I've criticized Ken Ham for essentially believing the titles of articles. Here he's like, hey, you shouldn't believe the titles of articles, but he himself rarely reads past the first line or a few paragraphs of just a general synthesis of science, a science promotion piece, not the actual original research, and therefore falls prey to these misconceptions himself. And if something seems to contradict God's word and that your interpretation of scripture is not faulty, take a closer look at what the scientist actually found versus what they've interpreted. Ken Ham could take his own advice here, or his writer's advice who are writing for him. Because this is what I do on Ham Bytes all the time. We show that if we go to the original paper, the original research, right, that he is misportraying that research because he's unfamiliar with the original intent and the original descriptions of the items that are being described in the popular press. Scientists are fallible. They weren't there in the past. Were you there? How do you really know that dinosaur slept in a bird-like pose? And they often make mistakes. Yes, people make mistakes, including Ken Ham. And their research reflects these limitations. You see, we know that birds, according to Ken Ham, were made by God separately on a separate day, and dinosaurs were created at a different time. So there shouldn't be ever any talk about mixing the two organisms together. Now, you also know, if you listen to me and other young creationists, that there are many who are fine with God having just created a type of creature that has dinosaur features and bird-like features, just like he created a flying squirrel that has the characteristic of being able to glide through the air between trees. That's kind of a bird-like feature, right? I'm sure it's been many other creatures. The platypus, right? We've described it being a mammal, but it also has characteristics that you might describe as being characteristics of other organisms. Those things don't seem to bother Ken Ham, but this bird dinosaur thing really seems to get his feathers out. Let's look at the original paper, because this is a really interesting paper. I think it's really interesting, and then it really struck me just how hypocritical Ken Ham is and Answers in Genesis and their writers, about how they just don't even think about what they're writing. They haven't even compared what they're saying to their own literature, things that they state at the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum. They're inconsistent with themselves. A new Alvarezsaurid dinosaur that's characterized in the theropods, right, sort of your upright walking dinosaurs on two back legs, in the Alvarezsauria, which is a large group of ones in what's generally called the mini raptors, right, or mini raptorids. A lot of them are very small, chicken-sized dinosaurs that walked on two legs, that had some kind of forearms that might have been altered into a number of different morphologies. Right, these are from the Upper Cretaceous, so they'd be at the very end of what we call the dinosaur age. And so a formation in Mongolia provides insights for the bird-like sleeping behavior in non-avian dinosaurs. So they found essentially something that's like a nest or an area that's been carved out in order to sleep. And this particular dinosaur has died in the position while it was asleep, and therefore we presumably captured the behavior of how it sleeps, and it sleeps in a particular position, which I'll show you in a moment. That is a very characteristically bird-like pose, as opposed to other dinosaurs in other groups. And therefore, that's the reason why we're saying a bird-like pose. Let's get right to it. Here's a little diagram showing you the bones that have been found of this particular dinosaur and the overall shape of, actually, this would be the general shape of an Alvarezsaurid dinosaur. Now, some of them are thought to have, there's some evidence that some of them had some type of feathers on them, and others, it doesn't seem like there's much evidence for feathers. The Alvarezsaurids are a large group of many, many different species that span over more than 100 million year time span in the age of the dinosaurs. And the image above gives you an idea of the overall size of a couple different genera within this particular group. So from very, very, very small up to like large chickens, all right? And a few were a little bit bigger than that, but we're generally talking about some really small, slender dinosaurs that were probably carnivorous. They have teeth, right? They have long, bony tails. They've got they have eyes. They have jaw sockets. They have a number of other hip features that are, clearly identify them as in the dinosaur group, but they also have bird-like traits as well, like this sleeping pose, and then potentially feathers. And this gives you an idea of how they kind of fit in. There's, of course, a lot of different ideas about how these different groups are related to one another. But this is one analysis, which is a fairly common one you'll see in terms of the organization of dinosaurs. So you have your Alvarezsaurids, right, which are these upright walking, sometimes feathered, especially in the late Cretaceous. The later ones seem to have more feathers than the ones that are earlier. So that's an interesting observation of their change over time in the fossil record that has been seen. And then we're going to look at the fingers on the hands too, which is a really interesting story about how they've changed as well. Then you got your oviraptors, you have your troodonts, all right, and then you have your dromaeosaurs. These are all different groups of dinosaurs that are recognized as having similar features, but they're separated into their orders basically, or superfamilies of dinosaurs, groups of genera, and even subfamilies, or you could even call them families, depending on who's classifying these. Of dinosaurs that have similar features, and so they're placed together in these categories. And then you've got a number of different things like Archaeopteryx and so forth. And then you've got the order Aviales, which is the group which contains all of the modern birds, right? All of the birds that we recognize with the features of living birds today. So it's your troodonts, your oviraptors, your Alvarezsaurids, and to a smaller extent, the groups that are above that all have bird-like features. And some have a lot of bird-like features, like the ability to fly, all right? Most of them are not flighted birds, entire groups, right, with dozens to hundreds of different species, none of which look like they're able to fly. They're all flightless, but they have bird-like traits as well. So there's this big menagerie of dinosaurs that have either fully dinosaur traits, in which you don't see very many at all bird-like traits, to some that have a lot of bird-like traits. And then, of course, a group that has all bird-like traits, although you could say that all birds have dinosaur-like traits as well. Now, this is the whole reason I wanted to bring this particular one up. I've talked about the bird dinosaur feather thing, and it seems like ad nauseum on this channel because Ken Ham can insist on bringing it up over and over again. So I'm going to hammer this point home in a way that I've never done before. Let's go to the Ark Encounter, and at the Ark Encounter, Ken Ham's Ark themed park, right? As you walk on board, and I've been on the Ark Encounter, there is a sign, there is a wall that has a list of all the different kinds of animals that Noah brought onto the ark, right? In their estimation, this is the list of kinds. I'm only showing you a small portion of it. I'm showing you the list of extinct ones. Actually, I'm only showing you a small portion of the extinct ones. So in this list, I went and I looked at it, looked at my picture that I have of it, and I asked myself, what do they think is a Alvarezsaurid? Right? Do they think that all Alvarezsaurids are in the same kind? Are they all related to one another? Right? And sure enough, I go to the list of what they think are the extinct reptiles. And you notice they have them listed as reptiles. On the Ark Encounter, they list them as reptiles. It's very clear. They have a reptile category. They have a bird category. And here they are. The Alvarezsaurids, which contains, that's the order, which contains all the things that have been called Alvarezsaurids, right? They have listed as a kind of reptile. Now, Ken Ham, in this other article that we're just looking at, says they're obviously birds, right? If it has bird-like features, right, bird-like traits, and you're calling it a bird-like dinosaur, then it is a bird. But here he's stating it is categorized not as a bird, it is categorized as a reptile. And then look down here. Oh, that's where the arrow's pointing. Look down here, we got Troodontidae. And down here we have the oviraptors. Okay. These are groups that clearly have feathered dinosaurs in them. They're not all feathered dinosaurs. There's only evidence for a couple individuals within these groups to have feathers. But those individuals are nearly morphologically identical. I mean, there's sister species or other genera, closely related organisms by all other accounts that are reptilian-like, dinosaur-like. And Ken Ham lists them as dinosaurs. He's listing a whole bunch of different families here that have very clear bird-like traits that on other pages and other times and other blogs of Ken Ham's, he has said they're obviously birds, but they're reptiles. Well, which is it? Ken Ham, which is it? Are they reptiles or are they birds? Let's look at this paper a little bit more, because I found it really fascinating to think about this. I don't know if I can call it a misconception. It's just confusion on Answers in Genesis part. They're making such a big deal about there being such a clear delineation between these two. They get upset by other creationists. Remember, they've written articles about other creationists calling them young earth evolutionists because they have capitulated to referencing particular dinosaurs as having bird-like traits, when they can't even get this thing straight themselves. So this is from the paper, all right, from PLOS One, which is an open access journal. And that's one of the reasons why I can show you these things from this very recent article. And they're showing a small phylogeny of how they think different dinosaurs are related, or bird-like dinosaurs are related, right? And this is their little representation of this bird that they found, which is this tiny little thing, all right, in a sleeping pose. And so that's what they're saying, is they found this sleep type pose in the Alvarezsaurid, all right? And that's the first time any Alvarezsaurid has been found in this particular position. Pretty rare to find a set of bones in a position that clearly is in a state of being asleep rather than a death pose or something like that. There's also fossils from the Troodonts, all right, which also have the same pose. And then, of course, birds, which also have the same way of sleeping, where they wrap their neck around and lay it on their side, all right, of the chest. And so they're suggesting that before we only knew about it in the Troodonts, but now we can expand this out to the Alvarezsaurids, which are not nearly as bird-like as some of the other bird-like dinosaurs, all right, the Troodonts and the Dromaeosaurs and so forth, and the oviraptors, which have much more advanced feathers and other features, and a few of them in those other groups actually have flight. right? Now they still have bony tails, they still have teeth, all right? They still have a number of other features that are very dinosaur-like and not modern bird-like. But the Alvarezsaurids are more dinosaur-like than these other groups, and yet they display this particular bird-like behavioral trait. So that's the thing that's, so what Answers in Genesis wants to do is they're constantly clawing off more and more and more dinosaurs and placing them in the bird-like category, especially if you used Ken Ham's really simple classification technique. If something has a bird-like feature, then you throw it into the birds. All right, if anyone references a bird-like feature of a dinosaur, then you're obviously looking at a bird, not a dinosaur. However, if you do that, then you're going to have to start coming way out here to some of these other dinosaurs, because some of them have primitive feather-like things, all right? So they're bird-like, so they're going to have to put them in the birds as well. And there's even other dinosaurs that Ken Ham in all instances would want to call a dinosaur that have some bird-like feature. Some evidence of thermoregulation, some evidence of more hollow bones, all right? Those are bird-like features. Those are characteristics that all birds have. Well, except penguins, which have like much more dense bones because they're flightless and they need to swim in the water and be pulled down in the water. But yeah, all right. So you can get into all these other, exceptions, which, that's the thing. You have to look holistically at organisms to understand how you're going to categorize them. You wouldn't want to ever look at one trait, which is why I really just don't understand this fascination with feathers. Like, oh, if something has a feather, it's got to be a bird. As if the Bible actually says that birds have feathers. I mean, bats can fly, but they don't have feathers. And yet they're classified as one of the flying creatures, all right, if you look at it from a sort of this biblical classification sense. All right, so why the obsession? Ken Ham is totally obsessed with single trait phylogenies, right? Using one trait to help you determine something. All right, but it gets better than this. This paper has some other interesting figures in it, which I thought were worth highlighting. Here's a figure of where different dinosaurs are found. So in Mongolia, in this particular mountain range, covering the late Cretaceous, but still covering like a 40, 50 million year period, they found a whole bunch of these Alvarezsaurids. All right, a bunch of different species, and you can see a bunch of different genera. So each one of these, you can see these scientific names on them here that are different from each other, right? I know that the organisms themselves look pretty similar, but it's like saying, like, here's a bunch of waterfowl, have a similar body plan, similar traits, but as you're going to see in a moment, there are differences between these different kinds or different species. Now, I'm sorry, I just used the word kind. Answers in Genesis says these are all one kind. They all originated from a common ancestor that God made. And so all this variety is just a variation on a theme of one kind. But, right, you see each one of these has a different genera name, indicating some fairly significant differences between them. And what they found is that there's different species in different layers of rock. And the particular new one that they're describing right here is in this what's called zone 4 in this particular set of strata. And that leads up to the what they call more advanced Alvarezsaurids. So we can see that in this image right here. We've got, this is showing the front hands, all right, or feet, but they don't use them as feet, right? So we can call them hands. In the very oldest one, so if we go back up here, if you look at these older rocks, right, the rocks that are lower down, and if you look at the fossils found in them in the what we would say is the original or ancestral type of Alvarezsaurids, we find that they have 3 digits, which is a feature of, say, many of your other theropods like T-Rex, right? You got your 3 digits. And so they're showing them in different, as different shades of gray to indicate which of the 3. And so as you move from left to right, you can see that 2 of these digits get reduced over time. All right, now I'm saying reduced over time. Why am I saying that? because on this particular figure, what you have is the ones at the bottom of the geological column, all right, where you first start seeing Alvarezsaurids. They've got 3 digits. And then as you move up, they start to have reduced 2 of the digits, and the 3rd digit gets larger and larger and larger. And by the time you get to the very late Cretaceous Alvarezsaurids, they basically only have 1 digit, and they have a slight remains of one of the 2nd digits that's actually fused, right, to the other 1st digit. And so they end up with a highly enlarged 3rd digit. It's thought that the very early ones were carnivores, and they're using their hands for grasping with these 3 digits, right? They have claws at the ends. And then eventually they lose 2 of the digits, and they only have 1 digit, but that digit then grows much, much larger and much more substantial, right? And so it has a large muscular structure in terms of the attachments to these large bones. And I think that this is for digging. And the type of claw at the end actually has changed as well. And this is more for digging behavior, or grabbing and pulling off, like bark off trees and things like that. There's a change in the birds or bird-like dinosaurs, right, from being probably strictly carnivorous, eating animals, other small animals, to at the end looking like maybe they're eating termites or other insects, all right? So they're digging through litter and pulling over, logs and ripping off bark and things like that in order to find insects to eat. And that's suggested by their tooth structure and their mouth construction, right? So that's also a form of behavior. You're interpreting behavior from the characteristics of the organism. But that's a fascinating trend that's seen in the fossil record. So that is something that it just, what does Ken Ham think when he reads stuff like this? If he ever, he didn't read this article, right? He didn't read this, but does he ever think, how does that fit into my worldview? How does that fit into a global flood? That you can find fossils at different layers, right? Even in Mongolia, where you can see the deeper layers have these Alvarezsaurids that have larger teeth, and they have 3 fingers. And then as you move up the fossil record, maybe not at the same location, at different locations, but nonetheless in different strata, you find that the traits, the characteristics of those organisms change. They're clearly still the same type of body plan, the same type of organism. And yet they have changed their characteristics and their behavior. And so how does a flood, really, how does a flood that just smashes all these organisms sort of all at one time or in the space of a couple of weeks sort out dinosaurs based on the number of digits on their fingers? How does it do that? How does it know to create that pattern? That's an awful big coincidence for something that was random. Right? There's 2 other things I want to mention about this. I've got that hypocritical thing where Ken Ham lists the Alvarezsaurids as a kind of dinosaur, and the oviraptors as a type of dinosaur, and the troodonts as a type of dinosaur at the Ark Encounter. And yet he consistently references them as being birds in some of his blog posts, and even he even acts like it's obvious that they're birds. They need some updating. They got to do some updating, and they need to admit that they were just wrong. Another point here, I'm showing this picture, which is just generated by Dolly, all right, of sleeping birds in a nest that are dinosaur-like. There's actually no physical evidence in that particular paper. I read the paper and I searched for feathers in the paper. There's no evidence from this particular fossil, this new species, that it had feathers. Now, it may have had feathers, but we don't have the right kind of preservation in order to preserve those feathers. But nonetheless, if Ken had read the paper, the only feature in this paper that's mentioned that's bird-like is this sleeping pose. Right? If you look at the rest of the characteristics of this organism, In other words, if I showed them this paper and we just took out sleep-like pose and the word bird-like in it and showed him the traits of these organisms compared to other dinosaurs, he'd be like, oh, that's a dinosaur, right? And I think he presumes that the organisms had feathers as well because they're usually shown in diagrams as having feathers. Likely did have feathers since many of the other Alvarezsaurids. There is evidence from other fossils that they had feathers, but not this particular one. So he doesn't necessarily have to, he can't point to this particular fossil and say, oh, it's got feathers, therefore it's a bird. It doesn't have any evidence of feathers. And so to him and his writers, this doesn't have the clear characteristics of a bird, unless he's just going with the bird-like sleeping pose, which is a pretty limited character to use to toss something out of being a dinosaur all the way into being the birds. A completely different organism created on a different day of creation. And my last point is, this dinosaur was found in a particular position that's not in a death pose, right? You sometimes you listen to younger creationists, they'll talk about like dinosaurs and other creatures being found with their necks splayed back as if they're drowning, right? Or they're in some kind of a very highly anxious state in those final moments of death. This particular dinosaur is found in what looks like a very calm position, right? It looks like it's sleeping. How does a dinosaur lie down, right? And multiple of these dinosaurs are found in nest-like features. How do they lie down and are sleeping in the middle of a chaotic flood? The whole world is covered with water, and maybe there's tsunamis and there's little patches of land, and we're told that how did dinosaurs make nests in the middle of the flood and leave dinosaur tracks right in the middle of the flood? Well, maybe there was like a day or two where, there's dinosaurs, they're hanging on to logs like rafts, right, during the flood. And then there's a little patch of land that shows up, right? That this sediment that's been laid down, but now the waters are receding there and they're going up somewhere else in these giant tsunamis, and the dinosaurs all jump off. Like, so these little Alvarezsaurids, right? They hop off and then they scurry across this land, and then I guess they're tired, and so they decide to take a nap. And then somehow they don't wake up when the next wave comes by. Like, how is it that we're finding dinosaurs? How do we find hundreds of nests in nesting locations? And those nests are on top of each other in terms of like, there was a nesting area here, and then there's a layer of sediment, and there's another nesting layer, and then there's layers of sediment. There's a whole nother area of nests, as if dinosaurs are coming back to the same location. Like maybe they're migrating and then they come back and they lay nests again the next season, they come back, right? How does that occur in a global flood, right? That's all happening chaotically all at one time. This is just yet another example when you start looking at someone's actual reported results of these dinosaur bones. It's so difficult to imagine in a chaotic flood. But can Ham mention all these particular features of these dinosaurs? No, he's simply focused on a popular press article in CNN that mentions the word bird-like. And he's so focused on that particular story that he never thinks about all the underlying evidence and the position of these birds in the geological column. Doesn't understand that he is referencing a bird here, or bird-like features, that's within a group of dinosaurs, some of which may not have this bird-like, well, I'm sure that out of the other 100 species that are known of Alvarezsaurids, there's probably never been another one found in this particular state, right? Well, I know that's the case because no one's reported yet. Otherwise, they would have already reported this bird-like pose. Wow. So So no other ones have ever been reported that way, right? So he thinks that they're dinosaurs, not birds. And now one has been found with the bird-like pose. And so therefore, what's he got to do? He's got to throw all these other 100 animals, which may have not had feathers and may have not slept in a bird-like pose. He's got to throw them into the birds now, because he's already admitted they're all part of the same kind, because they obviously share so many other characteristics that they must be related to each other by common ancestry. This is just how crazy and wild the biblical taxonomy gets, or at least Ken Ham's version of taxonomy gets. it's not informed by a cohesive set of analyses. It's informed by knee-jerk responses to just publicist reports, right? The spin that's put on it by people publicizing this type of research, not by the actual looking at the actual research itself. Okay, I feel like I'm beating a dead dinosaur here at this point. We've done this over and over and over again. I just thought this was a wonderful example of a really interesting fossil, and it pointed me to the fact that that I hadn't really noticed before, that Ken Ham's organization has already classified this group as dinosaurs. And yet here Ken Ham is on his blog talking about this as if it's obviously a bird. I don't, get your story straight out there. It's figure it out. Other young Earth creationists have. I don't know why Answers in Genesis can't figure these things out. All right, that's it for me today. Thanks everybody thanks for coming and hearing me complain about bird-like dinosaurs once again. We'll talk to you later.